the sands, you can see spice in the air.
There's a reason why Hollywood couldn't adapt Dune for decades. Not because it was too complicated, and not because it was impossible to film, but because Dune hides what it's actually about. On the surface, it looks like science fiction. A prophecy, a chosen one, a war for the universe. But that's not what Dune is. Dune is a warning about power, about religion, about empires, about the terrifying human desire to be led. That is what created a massive problem for Denis Villeneuve. Because the original novel spends most of its time inside people's minds. Thoughts, fears, calculation, prophecy. How do you turn that into cinema? The answer was to change Dune. And Denis has made it more faithful than ever. To understand why Dune had to change, you first have to understand what Frank Herbert actually wrote. Because Dune was never designed to entertain you in a traditional sense. It doesn't move like a modern science fiction. There are long stretches without action. Characters speak in riddles. Entire chapters revolve around suspicion, prophecy, and psychological warfare. That's exactly what made it so revolutionary. Because Dune wasn't trying to overwhelm readers with spectacle. It was trying to overwhelm them with scale. Not the scale of battles, but the scale of consequences. Every decision in Dune feels ancient, heavy, inevitable. Even conversations feel dangerous. Because everyone is manipulating everyone. The Bene Gesserit manipulates bloodlines. The Emperor manipulates houses. The Fremen manipulate prophecy. And Paul eventually learns to manipulate belief itself. That is the real power in Dune. Not the spaceships or the armies, not even the spice, but the narrative. The ability to control what people believe. And that is where adapting Dune became almost impossible. Because most filmmakers approach Dune like a science fiction story. But Dune isn't really science fiction. It's a political philosophy disguised as mythology. And the deeper you go into the books, the stranger the challenge becomes. Because the most important moments in Dune don't really happen physically. They happen internally. Fear and calculation, ancestral memory, religious terror, the burden of seeing the future. Frank Herbert wrote a story where the greatest battles happen inside the human mind, which raises an impossible question. How do you film consciousness? That is the problem Denis Villeneuve had to solve. I believe this is where Denis Villeneuve understood something most adaptations never do. Faithfulness is not about accuracy. It's really about translation. And translation always requires sacrifice. Because books and films do not speak the same language. Books can explain thought. Cinema has to make you feel it. That changes everything. Frank Herbert's Dune is dense with internal monologue. Characters are constantly calculating, predicting, manipulating, and interpreting hidden meanings. If Villeneuve tried to directly reproduce that, the film would suffocate under exposition. So instead, he transformed psychology into atmosphere. Notice how often characters barely speak. Villeneuve trusts the image to communicate dread. Scale becomes emotion, silence becomes tension, the desert itself becomes consciousness. And suddenly Dune stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like destiny. The most important change wasn't even visual, it was emotional. Because Villeneuve understood something crucial about the modern audience. People no longer trust prophecy the way they used to. And that changes how the story has to function. In older epics, the Chosen One was aspirational. In Villeneuve's Dune, the Chosen One feels horrifying. That's why Chani has also become so important. She's not just Paul's love interest anymore, she becomes the audience conscious. The one person asking the question that nobody else wants to ask. What if the prophecy is dangerous? and then suddenly, the entire story changes shape. Because the films slowly reveal something the book was always warning about. Paul Atreides is not becoming a hero. He is becoming a myth. And myths are far more dangerous. Because people will kill for myths. They will die for myths, surrender themselves to myths. Especially when those myths promise salvation. That is the true genius behind Villeneuve's adaptation. He didn't really simplify Dune, he made its warnings impossible to ignore. This is the point where Dune stops becoming science fiction. Because underneath the prophecy, beneath the empire, beneath all the spectacle, Dune is about one terrifying idea. Human beings want to believe, not to think, not to question, but believe. Frank Herbert also understood something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. That people are vulnerable to certainty, especially during chaos. When the world feels unstable, when systems collapse, when people feel powerless, they begin searching for saviors. And Dune asks a question that becomes more disturbing the older you get. What happens when a society stops wanting freedom and starts wanting certainty instead? Why? Because certainty is seductive. It removes doubt, removes responsibility, and removes fear. If someone claims destiny has already been written, then people no longer have to confront uncertainty themselves. Deep down, we may all crave subjugation. That is why the religious imagery in Dune feels so wildly overwhelming. Because Villeneuve wants you to feel how seductive this myth can be. It's not logical, but emotional. The Fremen don't follow Paul because of evidence. They follow him because he gives shape to their hope. And that is how all-powerful myths survive. Not through the truth, but through meaning. Which is why Dune feels so disturbingly modern. Because right now, we live in an age obsessed with identity, with ideology, movements, algorithms, parasocial leaders, digital tribes, and the internet has amplified humanity's oldest instinct, the desire to belong to something larger than ourselves. But Dune understands the cost of that desire. Because the terrifying part about Paul is that he sees the future clearly. He sees fanaticism, the slaughter, the holy war fought in his name. And he walks toward it. Not because he is evil, but because once people turn you into a symbol, you stop belonging to yourself. And right there, Dune reveals what it was really trying to say all along. The most dangerous leaders are not always tyrants. Sometimes they're the people humanity desperately wants to believe in. Perhaps it's why Dune might resonate so deeply, not because of sandworms or the spectacle or the scale, but because Dune understands something modern culture is slowly forgetting. Human beings are emotional creatures first, not rational ones. We tell ourselves that we're guided by logic, but history says otherwise. History is filled with empires, movements, leaders, religions, built on the human hunger for meaning. And Dune forces us to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the desire for meaning can become dangerous? What if the people who promise destiny are the people we should most fear? That's why Villeneuve's adaptation succeeds where others struggled. Because in essence, he understood Dune was never really about plot. It was about the atmosphere, the psychology of it all, the belief structure built into it. It's about how power feels. The films don't really just explain prophecy, they make the prophecy feel seductive. And that's what makes them so unsettling. Because somewhere deep down, we understand why people follow Paul, even knowing what comes next. And maybe that's the true brilliance of Dune. It doesn't really give us a hero, but more of a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest weakness, our desire to surrender uncertainty to someone who sounds certain. And perhaps that's why Dune had to change. because film cannot really show thought the way literature can. But cinema can do something else. It can make you feel awe. It can make you feel fear, faith, and more importantly, destiny. Books allow us to understand prophecy, but cinema allows us to believe in it.